guys, and thank you so much for joining me for another video. I am Kiki Cannon with Cannon Studios, and today we are going to be talking about resin, specifically Smooth On's EpoxAcast 690, which is what I use for all of my gems and different things that I have made in my shop. So if you're curious about working with it, go ahead and stick around. Thanks, guys. Here are some examples that I casted with the EpoxAcast. With this one, I added in a little bit of Smooth On's So Strong dye. So when you're adding in this pigment, you have to put the tiniest amount in. I usually just take a toothpick, dip it in, and then mix it. You might have to do some testing to kind of get the colors that you want. With this one, I added in different types of powders. Smooth On does have cast magic powder, but depending on what kind of powder you use and the weight of it, it might sink. So you want something kind of lightweight to stay kind of mixed well in the resin as it's curing. As I was working on my Cove Teroth costume, there was a lot of experimenting I did with EpoxAcast, and I used a variety of powders and glitters, and depending on the weight of the powders or glitters, you can almost get this falling effect with some of the results as I was trying a variety of things. And keep in mind that none of these are polished or clear coated yet, and I didn't heat up the resin or use any pressure pots or anything to get these results. As your item gets bigger, it's going to get a little bit more challenging to kind of get these consistent bubbleless results, and then it might be time to look into getting a pressure pot, but you can still get a decent sized item without bubbles, but it does get a lot more tricky depending on what you're doing. So here's an example of a two-part mold. When I was working on my Cove Teroth blades, I had to do various testing, and this is a piece of one of my tests. So for a two-part mold and something that's pretty thick, it can be pretty difficult to get no bubbles without having a pot or anything like that because the molds are so big. So the reason why I wanted to use EpoxAcast is because I really wanted the edges to look like ice, but then I also wanted to be able to have lights kind of feed through. And when I got to the bigger pieces, the color kind of changed to look more like water, which kind of worked because it's a little bit more difficult depending on how big your piece is to really get all the bubbles out. My molds were so big though, it didn't really make sense at the time to invest into a pressure pot because they were too big to fit in one anyways. So I tried to come up with different techniques to try to figure out how to get as little bubbles as possible, which is mostly just how you tilt the mold and how you slowly pour it in to try to prevent as little bubbles as possible. For the nook leaves I make, I also use the EpoxAcast. This specific blue colored leaves were made specially for Andy Ray's Cosplays charity stream on Twitch, where she helped raise money for Kidney Foundation. So this is just some of the items that were auctioned off to raise money, along with a lot of paintings that she created and a lot of other artists contributed to. So if you have time, I recommend checking out Andy Ray Cosplay on Twitch. She's an amazing, lovely person. The artists community on Twitch is super lovely. So if you haven't been on Twitch at all and you like creating, it's definitely a positive community that I would recommend. Also, feel free to head over to my cosplay shop, Cannon Studios, on Etsy, where I do sell these nook leaves from Animal Crossing, along with a lot of other cosplay accessories that I make. We're going to be pouring one of these nook leaves right now, along with some other gems that I make in my shop as well, so stick around for that. So be sure to mix up the part A and B of EpoxAcast really well before you start measuring it out, and you will need a scale for this. It is 100 parts A by 30 part B, so if you need a smaller amount, it is a little bit of math, but it's not too terrible. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix the 100 by 30 and use the extra for some gem molds that I need to make anyways. So as you can see, this is part A, and part B is a little bit more liquidy. We're going to go ahead and pour part B into part A and make sure to get it all in there. And you can see it's kind of a little bit separated, so you can still see if it's not mixed well. So go ahead and mix it until it's absolutely consistent. And you have a 5-hour pot life, which may vary depending on temperature, so you do have some time. Once you got part A and part B fully mixed, go ahead and let it set for probably about 10 or 15 minutes until there's absolutely no bubbles in it and it's crystal clear. And this is exactly how you're going to get that consistent results of no bubbles. So when you just pour it in, just pour closely to wherever you're pouring and make sure to just let it slowly run into the object. Because we're pouring it on an object and we're not pouring it into a mold, we're going to get really clear, shiny results without any kind of polishing or clear coats. I'll be showing you guys the end result as well as the gems that I went ahead and poured. If you ever use a resin and you end up having a kind of cloudiness to it, it's usually a symptom of humidity or contamination. The nice thing about EpoxAcast is that humidity doesn't affect it and you'll never really get this cloudy effect. And here we have our end result of our Nook leaf. And as you can see, it came out perfectly clear and shiny with no imperfections. And here are all the little gems that I poured with my silicone molds. So I'm going to go ahead and take all of these out. So as you can see, all of them consistently have the same results with no bubbles using the same method that I did on the leaf. If you have any results where the item is maybe kind of gummy, it's usually because it hasn't been the full 24 hours yet, or maybe your ratio was a little bit off. Sometimes if you mix really tiny batches, it can get a little bit trickier, so the closer you can get to the 130 or more is generally better. So here's these little tiny gems that I casted that I used on my Coal Terra. So to back these, I used nail polish. And as you can see, there's some excess, which is easy to just trim off and sand around the edges if you need to. Here's the prism crystals that I also cast for my Sailor Moon ones. And as you can see, it's a pretty thick gem, and I'm still able to get pretty clear bubbleless results. Obviously this isn't really polished yet, so once it's polished, it's definitely going to be a lot shinier and a lot clearer after that. Here's also the custom gems that I make for my Sailor Moon and Sailor Scout tiaras. So I will take some sandpaper and kind of shape them a little bit and take out any of the edges that might be sticking up so they're more even and more oval in shape. And last but not least, here are these Bridget gems that I casted, and for these I used acrylic paints so I could kind of paint out a kind of gradient coloring, which is a little bit more challenging to do with the nail polish, which is why I decided to move to acrylics for that. Hey guys, thank you so much for enjoying my video. I hope that you enjoyed it. So if you got something out of it, feel free to like and subscribe to get future videos. If you have any comments about working with the resin, feel free to leave them below. Also, if you have any future recommendations for videos you'd like to see, go ahead and let me know. And of course, feel free to hang out with me on Twitch at twitch.tv/KikiCannon. Thanks guys.